All right, yeah, I see, I got it. Is it possible to make one's living by coding applications, musical applications?
I think it's probably challenging, but possible. I'm in the lucky place that I'm on a pension, so this is additional income that allows me to do hobbies. Sure. Yeah. And partly that's driven my pricing. I've been very competitive in the way I price my modules. Partly when I first started, it's like, well, I don't know how much they're worth. They're so simple. But it's like a lot of these things, how much they're worth is how much people want to, are prepared to pay for them. I could probably charge more, but I just don't feel it's right to do so, given it is something that's giving me joy just watching people making use of them, and gives me some income, which, as I say, helps fund the music side of things. There are others out there who are able to do that. I suspect if you're trying to do that, you may want to do multiple platforms. So that may be the point that you actually work in a way that you can deliver both on Voltage Modular and VCV. And you'd have to think about how to write your code to do that. But because obviously Java and C++ are quite different in many ways, but it's not impossible, because you could, the way you structure your code would allow you to do that. But that would take a bit of thought and experience to do. I think most of the people developing for Voltage Modular are making, I'm not sure if they're making a complete living on the back of it. Let's put it that way. Some of them maybe, but I think some of them have a mixture. They do DJing or whatever else. The others, Grazer, is it, who's an Italian musician who's got loads of modules. But I think it's, so I think it really depends. If you're going to try and make a living of it, I think you'd have to think about a number of other things around. I don't think just one platform would necessarily do that.
No, okay, sure.
I think this is it's an interesting question, because I've got a very particular point of view based on my experience, and I'm not sure how easily that translates to other people's experience of this. But let me put down what I've found in my journey through this. I think as a background, it's worth saying, I'm in the very fortunate position that this was always going to be an additional source of income, not a primary source of income. Having retired a few years back, this allows me to do the stuff I love in terms of music, in terms of working with music and writing music and producing music and getting music out there. And it basically, it's helping me fund my hobby. So that's a really nice place to be, and I'm forever grateful that I'm in that space. It has allowed me to take an approach on pricing and the way that upgrades, basically anybody who buys into a collection of my modules, as I add modules to those collections, they get those for free. So that sort of commercial model is really only possible because of where I am in my life. I think if I was in a different situation, I'd have to think about those commercial decisions in a different way. But there's plenty of people out there who are making a living from working in this space. I think looking at the people using Voltage Modular and developing modules for that, I think there's probably a mixture. I think there's some who are a bit like me in that it's an additional source of income and it allows them to do stuff they want to do, or just they just enjoy doing it, which is also where it started for me. And there's others who I think are much more have a business around it. But I think in those cases, looking at a number of examples, I can name PSP Audioware as one example of a developer who really crosses multiple platforms. So they develop audio effects for VST and AU plugins for Windows and Mac. They develop for VCV and they develop for Voltage Modular. And I can see that as a commercial operation works probably really well. There's other developers who are just within Voltage Modular, or maybe Voltage Modular and VCB, who have, again, I think my understanding is they've made a good business out of it. But I think it really depends on where you're starting and where your aim is. If I was setting up for the first time now with the aim of this becoming my full-time job, I think I'd do a couple of things. First, I would look at how my pricing model and upgrades and so on, how that commercial model worked. And it's a balance, because I've been in the very fortunate situation. I started really quite early on, one of the first third-party developers with Voltage Modular. And my growth has been very much on the back of the growth that Voltage Modular has had. And I started at that point when they've got a quite aggressive pricing model. I followed that. I also have a number of other vendors I tend to use because they've got really good pricing, and it sort of gets out of it moves the decision point to a much easier place. And that obviously has a benefit in terms of volume. But making those decisions, if it was my long-term livelihood, it would be possibly different results that I'd come up with in terms of how I structured that. I would almost certainly think about working with other platforms, so I would probably look at also developing some of the modules, if not all of them, across to VCB. Although that's a fairly big step in terms of that direction. I think it's easier if people have been developing on VCB coming across to Voltage Modular. And I'd also potentially look at different types of modules in that situation. So I would be looking at more of the DSP type modules, so oscillators, audio sources, effects, and the things that I haven't focused on here, because obviously there's more value potentially in those, and also there's the opportunity for, certainly in the effects range, taking those across to VST and AU plugins to sit within doors directly rather than being hosted within Voltage Modular or VCB. So I think it really depends where you're aiming for, but I think absolutely, yes, you can do it. Yes, it's possible to make a living on the back of that, and there are plenty of examples of people out there doing it.
I think so. All right. Is it necessary, or perhaps even needed, or not at all, to have a musical background when you go and code musical applications?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. That's an interesting one.
Perhaps even not necessary at all. Perhaps it's better not to have.
Yeah, you got me on this one. That's a really clever question. I think it helps if you understand what sonically people are wanting to do with things. So what they're trying to achieve with the modules in a musical, or maybe not even, maybe atonal, whatever, but in a sonic manner. Without understanding that, I think it might be quite difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, and certainly you don't have to be a musician necessarily to do it. I think, although I think, again, it helps, and certainly from my perspective, music's always been part of what I am. Sort of, it's embedded in me, so it just sort of happens. If I didn't have any of that, I think it would be difficult. Because how would you, unless you were being told, make me one of these, actually coming up with the ideas would be quite challenging.
I see. So your musical background includes some musical education, am I right?
Yes, yeah. So I didn't go to music school or anything like that, but I did learn piano in my, right through to when I was about in my early 20s. I was still learning. And I got to a grade 7 in the UK. There's 8 grades in the sort of non-performer level of grading. So a relatively accomplished pianist. That was obviously primarily classical music. And I also did both at school, well, yeah, primarily at school, I learnt church organ as well, which is hard work, trying to think about all those, when you've got more, the multiple levels of keyboards isn't the problem, but the pedal work as well, that's where it gets interesting. But yeah, so that was my background in terms of learning music. But in my last couple of years at school, I was in a number of school bands. I got a Farfisa organ, a Roland SH1000 synth, and that was the start of my journey there. So yeah.
Yeah. Do you see yourself more as a performer, or more as a composer, or like an all-rounder or all-round producer? How do you see yourself?
Not as a performer these days. I think at some point I might have a go at that, but obviously with the amount of technology and the reliance on technology, taking that out into an environment where it's not a known environment is always interesting, should we say, and would need a lot of thought. That's part of the reason I actually got the real synths, because I thought if I'm ever going to do it, I want to have some physical hardware synths that if everything else fails, I've got something that's going to keep working. What you don't want is something to crash right in the middle of anything and nothing be available. So that's that. These days, I don't see myself as a performer. It would be every so often I have it would be nice. If I was going to do that, frankly, I'd want to do it more than just me. I'd actually want to do that in some form of, we're in a band sort of situation where you've got that interplay going on as well. So at the moment, composer, producer, that's my focus. But like anything, I've got plenty of years ahead of me to change what I want to do on that, and that's the great thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, so mixing, mastering, producing, all on your own sounds a little bit like a solitary worker. Am I right or not?
It is, but I'm very lucky in that I've got a number of people that I rely on for what you might call the trusted ears to critique me. But I've also got a very good friend who has been in the music business the whole of his life. He was in the band, one of the bands I was in, and we set up a band for a number of years. And he effectively helped on the last album by, I wanted to credit him as producer because actually he did a lot of the feeding into that decision processing. He said, at best call me executive producer or not. He wasn't bothered. So, but he really acted as a critical ear to me. He helped me decide which tracks made it and which ones didn't. Those sorts of decisions, which on your own is really hard, I think. That's the bit where it becomes really difficult. But up to that point, I find it is a solitary thing. If you're writing music that is that is just you on your own, if it's not a band situation, then you can do most of that on your own. You can certainly do the first sets of mixes because you know what you're trying to achieve. But at that point, I was really lucky that it was really helpful having his input, but also some other people's input along the way. So there was a few months where he was here probably once or twice a week, spending a few hours. We'd just go through where I'd got to, he'd make comments and we'd try stuff. And so I had that feedback. So I think it's really hard to be completely solitary. I don't know, experience of other people and the interview you recently did. I think having people involved in making sure that what you come up with actually works, because you do get very close to it. You do get so close to it, sometimes you can't see where things aren't necessarily working as well as they should. So having that critical ear, I think, at the very least, is really important.
I think one of the hardest things a producer has to learn in his or her younger days is when to stop, when to say that's it. Okay.
Yeah,
that's it. Let's go to the next.
Yeah, you can always do something better. You can always, oh, that little tweak. Oh, that little. Oh no, we won't go back to another one.
It's a little bit with mastering as well. You can master a piece completely and completely damaging it by making it too perfect. All right. Software instruments, hardware instruments in your productions. So not talking about live situations. What do you prefer? Do you use both or? Well,
for the stuff I've done up until now, it's been purely software, and the reason for that was was quite simple. When I was working away a lot of the time from home. So the only way I had a way of taking my ability to capture any music when I was in the mood, which was too infrequently, frankly, because you were very busy working away, but the only way to do that was software. The second part was I've got a shopping list as long as your arm of what hardware I'd love to have. I would have to sell the house. And I can get most of it in reasonable form as software. So that's another driver, frankly. And I've built that software library over the years. So it's probably, there's a fair amount invested in it, but it's been in very small chunks. Hardware tends to be in bigger chunks. And certainly if I wanted to I'd love to have a modular sitting on the back wall there.
Make one.
That's still expensive. So and the other thing is, again, my workflow. One of the things that I'll put the 2 points actually side by side, because my first bands, I built up a fairly big rig actually in my 20s. My favorite bands at the time, well, my favorite bands actually still now, were people like ELP, but also Tangerine Dream, Rick Wakeman, and my rig was not quite as big as most of those, but not far from it. I had some mini Moogs, and the immediacy of those controls is wonderful. So, but you have to remember what they are. It's that take a photograph of the settings. How do I get that exactly the same next time I want to try and just finish off this track? Oh, I can't get it quite. And some of that accident is great. And I know, reading some of the stories and listening to some of the interviews of people like Tangerine Dream, the vast, so much of what came out of their early work was the accidents. The oscillators being out of tune, all of or turning out of tune over time, and all of that. And that's great, but certainly when I was doing it as a hobby alongside work, where you're not able to focus on it for any length of time, going back to it 2 weeks later, having something that made that difficult to do really would have got in the way. So software back then obviously was so much more powerful than most synths in terms of their ability to remember that and remember it with the songs. Obviously, hardware synths have got much better over the years. So, modulars, interesting point. Once you patch it and you change the patch, well, how do you remember? You can't go undo. Exactly. Very different way of working. So I've just fallen into that way of working. So software's been there as the constant, if you like, since I family commitments and so on meant that big rig got sold over time. Pity I didn't hold on to some of it, because I'd have made some better money from it. So I've been software for many years. These days, I'm relearning how to use hardware. And I'm in that stage. I'm still learning to get the workflow to work for me. So one of the things that the two physical keyboards I've got now, one's the Arturia Polybrute, and the nice thing with that is it's got a VST plugin that works with it, so that you get close to that environment of being able to remember everything within the context of the song and everything else. And the other one's the Hydrasynth, and the ASM Hydrasynth I just love as a pure digital. You know, the wavetable stuff, the ratchets, it's a joy to play, and I just fiddle with that, and you know, and that's the great thing with those. But I'm just in the process of relearning how to work with that in terms of composing. Going forwards, I'm sure that there will be a mixture of songs, some which will be pure software, some which will be a mix of both, maybe some which are primarily the hardware synths. I don't know, but the music will drive that, and you know.
Yeah, sure. I saw on at your website you have the huge Arturia synth collection, and am I right when I say you are working with different controllers?
Yes, yeah. So
why?
Again, most of this isn't, you know, it's not hard. Because as a pianist, I love including piano, not all the time, but when I want piano, I want it to be really piano-like. So for the pianos, I use Pianotech. I don't know if you've ever come across it as a piece of software. It's a wonderful piece of software that allows you to do all the half pedaling. It's purely, it's not sample based. It's all, you know, it was a university piece of work that came out with how to do the algorithms to do this. And what I then wanted was a full range 88 note keyboard with a piano touch, and over time, so the early photos from the studio, it was the Arturia, both the 88 note and the smaller one. I've now moved to the Studio Logic SL Grand, because that gives me the release velocity, which Pianotech can use as well, and the half pedaling behaviors. So it gives me as close to a piano as you can physically get, I think, apart from the Kawai ones, which are slightly better but bigger and very much more expensive. The Studio Logic gives me that, and that touch is quite hard, like any piano, and it's very, you know, that sort of response is very specific. The smaller one, which is I've gone for another Arturia on the top. Basically, I also wanted a synth feel and an organ feel, a Hammond feel.
I see. Yeah. I see.
So actually having two types of keyboards was important for the way I play. So yes, I could have probably used one of those to do much of what I want, but having both allows me to use those in the way that you would expect them to behave. So when I'm using synths, it'll typically be on the Arturia, on the Keylab 61.
I got it.
But you know, if for instance, and again, having two, I will quite often record ideas down using all the keyboards. I get really, yes, you can use splits for some of those things. I get confused by splits. They drive me nuts most of the time. I just can't get my head around it. Having physical keyboards,
yeah.
a lot easier.
Sure,
I'm a real simple guy. The other one I've got is the Roli Seaboard, which is the MP. Again, I'm only still touching the surface of that. That's because I'm classically trained. That's actually such a jump in terms of how you interact with it, and the fact that if you land your finger just a little off, it is a little off. All those sorts of things. It's interesting. But I've used it for some things that would have been very difficult to achieve otherwise already. Some of the music, and I'm sure I'll use more of that. I also have a tiny little thing over here, one of the X-Key 25s.
Okay.
Just simply because it's right by the PC. Because when you're doing patches and stuff, having to reach over and then
Sure.
So it's just practical stuff, frankly.
So far I haven't been brave enough to go into Roli.
It's if I was looking now, interestingly, there's a few others out there where they've got close to the rubber, all the dimensions, but with a physical key. So I've forgotten who it is, and I'd have probably, if I was looking these days, I would have certainly tried those out as an alternative. So that they have keys, but the keys do move vertically, horizontally, and everything else, and have sensors so you can move up and down. That would have probably been more comfortable for me as a way of using that type of device. But having said that, it is interesting when you're trying to do acoustic instruments like violins and stuff. Actually, having it where it doesn't quite hit, it does give realism that you wouldn't get any other way. And that's what I want to really learn to play with on the Roli, is that sort of intonation that you can only get by not having perfect tone.
Yeah, I see. Like a breath controller for keyboarders.
Yeah. I've actually, I did get a breath controller, but I struggle to use that. Primarily because I wanted to be able to do sax. And I've got Limplug did a great sax plugin years ago. Unfortunately, they've obviously stopped developing these days, and that accepts the breath controller. But going any further for those sorts of things, I haven't experimented with that because it's one of those things that just didn't come naturally to me. You have to try some of these things out, frankly, don't you?
Okay. What are you working on at the moment?
I'm literally in the middle of a small release for the modules. So I did a fairly major one earlier this year, about a month back. And then about 3 weeks later, Voltage Modular released version 2.5, and there's some UI things that didn't break because we worked through making sure they didn't. But I'm just optimizing the UI because there's some bits on there where it shows. I don't know if on the ARC 2600 you have, like on a semi-modular, you have the labels which show what normally goes in unless you plug in. And within Voltage Modular you can do quite a lot of that these days. And one of the things I've been working on is making my modules take advantage of that as much as possible. Because again, just for ease of setup, if you want, if it's 90% of the time it's the gate going in, well, why not have that as the default? That sort of behavior. But the labels have to be quite small because I keep my modules small, and they weren't rendering especially well. They render better now, so I'm just spending a bit of time just improving those, making the modules take advantage of that and make sure the lining, it's as clear as possible as it can be. So little tweaks, a few changes of. Every time I go through, it's interesting. I'll find another thing which actually there's a bug there that I should fix. People haven't found it, but it's like, that's not behaving as it should do. And that leads on to some interesting challenges, which I'll talk about very briefly. Because one of the things I spend a lot of time on my modules is if I do make a change that could break somebody's patch, I'll spend quite a bit of time working out how to give a legacy mode or something in it so that it doesn't break those legacy patches, allows them then to maybe having loaded it, then get it into the new way, or just leave it. And so with a number of the modules, I actually have legacy modes built in, or at the very least, it brings forward old patches and adjusts them in the correct way to the new. That probably can be 40 or 50% of the development work that goes on in updating modules. But this time, this is a quick run through. It's still, I've got a lot of modules, so it's not, it takes time. There's a couple of new modules I've been thinking about, which I'll probably throw into the mix just because why not? It's again, interestingly, new modules tend to be quicker than maintaining old modules. Because when you're doing fresh code,
I can imagine.
So that's probably going to be the next week or 3. The process of releasing it and stuff takes time. like your last guest, whose name I should remember, but I can't. It's interesting that you've got this mixture of the business and the
yeah.
And you know, so you're doing all of these things, both as a musician. You have exactly the same. And that was the fascinating, fascinating part of learning to release my first album, was all the stuff I had to learn about in terms of how to do, who to use as my route into the distribution, what that meant, how I had to set that up, what I should do around things like PRS and registering there. So the work factors around that were. It was really fascinating learning about it.
Yeah, Bernie.
Work.
Bernd Michael Land. Bernie is his name.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And it's the same with Voltage Modular, because each release, I've got to make sure the help is up to date. I've got to make sure that's published on the website. I've got to update the product information, and so on and so on. Yeah. So once I've got it to, I've written it. I've now got to do I've released. It's the release process. So that's going to be the next few weeks. And then I'm hoping to get back into doing the music, because I'm sort of my headspace is getting to that point where the ideas are flowing. I'm feeling comfortable. I've been doing a refresh. I did a refresh on the hardware last year, but I hadn't really tweaked it and optimized it and just got everything working 100% how I want it to. I've been doing that in the background the last couple of weeks. So I'm sort of in the space, right, I can sit down and I can start putting these ideas actually into something and see where it takes me. So that's my hope.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. And we're out of the worst of COVID. Obviously, there's other things going on in the background now, which doesn't, there's the last few years have just been dire in so many ways for so many people, haven't they? And it continues for some, for too many at the moment. But the weather's getting nicer in the UK. We're out of lockdown. All those things say, actually, maybe now's the time.
I see.
I'm in the middle of just finishing off a small release of the modules, and that'll be my focus over the coming weeks. And that's really just quite simply, Voltage Modular released an update quite recently to 2.5, which included quite big changes around support for Apple Mac native, the new ARM-based architecture, but also internally they made some changes that just improve the way graphics and text can be rendered, particularly when it's smaller items. And I use those quite a lot in the way that semi-modulars like the ARP 2600 have default paths. Within Voltage Modular, there's a number of the key inputs, like things like pitch, like gates, like the triggers, like the sustain and things like that. And I try wherever possible to make those automatically available as a default route into a module with the ability to override it with a jack. And the labeling of that tends to be quite small, simply because I try and optimize the space. And the rendering has improved that to the point where I want to take advantage of that improvement, and therefore I just need to do a little bit of work on each module. So there's a fair bit of work there to do that, to test it and get it ready for release. And as I think Bernd mentioned in your recent talk with him, it's not just about the development cycle of doing these modules and getting them to work. There's the business piece of getting them published. So within Voltage Modular, and you send it up to the store, you then test it within Voltage Modular, and then you have to get it approved. But also, there's help files that need to be potentially updated. There's potentially graphics in the catalogue that the store displays that maybe you need to update, or the text itself if you're making additions to there. So that process will take a few weeks. There's probably a few modules that I may well throw in as part of that. So a few small ideas I've got that may just get turned into new modules as part of that release, and then push it out as a release, put it out on the various social media channels and so on. So there's the business end of that as well, which goes with it. once I've done that, my aim is to really get back into music mode. So I've got a lot of ideas that I've collected over the last couple of years, sitting there waiting for me to turn into or see if they work as new ideas. And so that'll be my focus probably pretty much the rest of this year, although there may be another module release, I don't know. One of the real benefits I've got in this not being a full-time business and therefore having deadlines and so on, it really does, the flow goes whichever way it goes. So I'm really, really grateful that I'm in that situation. But currently my aim is that by the end of this year, I'll have the music for another album at least complete, maybe not physically released by that time, but have that in a state where it's moving forward quite quickly to a release state. So that's what I'm hoping for this year. And the sun's out. We seem to be through the worst of the COVID side of things. So my creative juices have started to flow once again, and I've still got loads to learn. I've got new keyboards to get to grips with, and part of that will be experimenting and seeing where that takes me musically. So yeah, that's my plan for this year really, is get this release out of the way of the modules and then really get back into music and thinking about and just enjoying making some more music, and hopefully we'll have something by the end of the year.
Andrew, I thank you a lot. It was fascinating.
I hope it was.
To talk to you. Yeah, great. And let me say, I'm sure it wasn't the last contact, the last talk, perhaps even about slightly different matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good luck, a lot of success, a lot of fun with your work, a lot of creative energy, and well, enjoy your day.